So today I was going to talk to you about change, and change in our Unitarian Universalist context. It was about 4 years ago, in that blessed time before COVID, after my retirement from full-time ministry at the First UU Church in downtown, and also from the Thoreau congregation out in Richmond, that my wife Nina and I found that this was a good place for us to find a community of compatible folks who had similar values to ours. It does not seem like yesterday. It seems like a very long time ago that we didn't have to worry about COVID at all. We didn't know that contagious diseases would change our lives so easily, so quickly. And the intervening time has obviously been full of many significant changes for churches everywhere, not just Unitarian Universalist congregations. But many of the changes, especially those COVID restrictions, were not welcome changes. Most of those changes were painful in some way and involved lots of time, energy, and resources to work through all the implications and make the adjustments that seemed necessary. We did have a survival instinct to do what was absolutely required. We had to change to meet changing circumstances. But I venture to say now that these adaptations have made it possible to be here together now in this place and at this time. But today I want to look beyond our immediate context of changes. So I wanted to share some personal reflections on some of the ongoing transformations that are underway in the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. Today I'm wearing my name tag from a meeting in Pittsburgh a few weeks ago, the last week of June. The General Assembly that has been held in some context, including a couple of summers of mostly virtual meetings. This year's General Assembly theme was Faithfully Becoming, was held in Pittsburgh. And I think the theme was intended to challenge and encourage us to actively participate in considering and promoting constructive engagement with process and procedure and public profile adaptations. And we could think of them as possible transformations in our Unitarian Universalist faith tradition to make it even more relevant to the changing society around us. Now, my experience of General Assembly has always been a celebration of what Unitarian Universalists are holding up as their values. The resolutions, the actions of immediate witness. But the theme this year of constructive engagement with the future was explicit in every possible way. And as an old-timer who's been involved with the congregations and with the Unitarian Universalist Association itself over the past roughly 40 years, I've become much more attentive to the relational elements of the gathering. The people, the sermons, the seminars, even more than the delegate responsibilities for debating and voting these word statements of what we think and what we believe is right. I was struck with the order of service today that Janice and others had put together, because these folks are my tribe. The reading from Stephen Kendrick, he has been a minister in Boston for most of his career. I got to know him through General Assembly. Gordon, or Bucky McKeeman, is someone who's been a prominent leader in Universalism, even before the Unitarian Universalist merger in 1961. I knew him in his retirement in Charlottesville, Virginia. I knew Betsy Darr well because she was my mentor when I was in seminary in California. She was the person who directed my religious education experience while I was teaching second graders in the San Francisco church, and she was the religious education director. These are folks that have aged even faster than I have somehow. It's really awesome to have been part of their community and to know them in a little bit more than an abstract way, because I was in the middle of what was happening. The world was changing. I was learning how to become a minister and how to become a better minister over the years. General Assembly has, over these past 40 years, become an annual chance to connect with people we don't see anywhere else. And again, this year, Nina and I spent most of our free time at General Assembly with longtime friends from around the country. But one of those good friends, who's been a colleague over the past 25 years, who was a religious education director for years before he went to seminary, was Reverend Chris Bice of Knoxville. Chris was asked to present the major featured sermon at the Service of the Living Tradition, where rites of passage honor the transitions of professional leaders, those who have retired, those who've died, those who are in the early stages of their careers. Following the songs and prayers and formal rites of passage, the really wonderful rituals, my friend Chris started his sermon by sharing with us his own variation on the often quoted saying, "Leading church groups can be like herding cats." Not ladybugs, but cats. Cats have a way of coming and going at a whim, insisting on absolute independence as long as they are fed and provided a comfortable place to sleep, which is sometimes a box or a chair or just a little place on the carpet someplace, when they choose to be with us. Some ministers have said that church members have the same priorities. They want to be fed and they want to have a place to sleep on Sunday morning. But to be honest, we could say that we belong to our cats, not the other way around. And the same is true for Unitarian Universalist churches. They belong to their members, you folks. So nothing important should or can be really changed without bringing those cats, those members, to consensus. I must acknowledge there can be bad changes that are not promoting the values that we hold together. And we need to resist those changes and change the changes. But there are changes that can be promoted, that can be positive or at least neutral to those of us who are part of the community. And discerning the difference, much like the Serenity Prayer, is something that we ought to be able to really consider. My friend Chris shared his observations that congregations are not just like cats, but they're also like turtles. They can cross the street when they decide to, but it's sometimes very slow. And they also can change, but slowly. Unlike our usual image of slow, quiet turtles, if the ministers or church leaders hassle the congregational turtles to move faster than they want to, we can be bitten. So that's a cautionary note to those who are leaders. So the metaphor that Chris delivered to those in the audience at that time was that sometimes leading congregations through unwelcome or unanticipated change can be carrying a basket of lovable snapping turtles to someplace they don't want to go, at least not right away. Well, I had taken some measure of pride in being able to attend, I think it's 36 consecutive annual General Assembly meetings, except one I remember I did on virtual. Since the summer I was elected to serve as president of a small South Carolina fellowship in 1987. So I identify with several of you in this congregation who have served as president, and Gary this year also. But as I observed the meetings, it became clear to me that the responsibility for turtle motivation is ultimately with the elected lay leaders. And so when I decided to be a professional called minister and leave the practice of law, which I had only been doing for about 20 years, and go to the trouble of attending seminary, I believe that I could be more effective and have a greater sense of meaning in my life if I could help those lay leaders and guide them and empower them to help the turtles along their way. And because of my attendance at the annual meetings, I've been extremely fortunate to form lasting relationships, as I mentioned, with some of the other ministers and religious education directors. But I've seen the evolution, the gradual change at General Assembly over those years. And so I've helped, and I've been helped by attending, and I've helped others to more effectively guide congregations toward the constructive engagement in some of the really important things that have happened to the UU Association in those 40 years of my activity. I would mention, of course, our engagement with gay rights, with gay marriage, with the inclusion of more and more women into the denomination as professional leaders. Ordination of women has become a really significant part. We've been welcoming transgender folks, not only into our congregations, but into our ministry. These past 40 years, it's changed from a majority white male-led denomination to a majority female and gay ministry. And I think that's a fantastic evolution over those 40 years that would not necessarily have been anticipated if we hadn't had asserted the rights of all and the welcoming congregation movement to make that possible. Virtual attendance, though, at the large meetings and even in our congregation is a transition that before COVID I would not have ever guessed, because it's been so important to me to be in contact with folks in person. And I'm just not excited to be in Zoom meetings myself. I recognize that this particular service is one of many that's been recorded. And I certainly welcome those who are choosing a different place and a different way to be in community with us. But it's not something that I enjoy. And old-timers like me are resistant to accepting what seem to be necessary changes and expectations about changing patterns from what were comfortable patterns for old people like me. Perhaps those of us who are present today in this space and time are kind of making a personal testimony that it's very important that we're resisting that YouTube and Zoom and Facebook way of being virtually present, which has become so dominant in our experience of all kinds of gatherings over these past 3 years of dealing with COVID. I bet some of you in this room today may even still like to read books and newspapers on paper. We are dinosaurs, though. There's so few of us who are subscribing to paper newspapers. Well, Darwin's theory of evolution made the point that survival of species is totally determined by their ability to adapt to sudden and long-term changes in the environment. We are relieved to know that our children and grandchildren are already successfully adapting to changing circumstances, even though some of us are still resistant to making those changes. Our granddaughters can actually be outside in 100 degrees and not feel like they're dying immediately. It's something that some of us cannot adapt to, but they seem to be able to. I mean, I admit that I'm probably reacting a lot like my own grandfathers reacted to changes they encountered 60 or 70 years ago. But what is the major organizational change which some of us can find controversial among Unitarian Universalists in the second decade of the 21st century? It's a proposal to change some words in our principles and purposes. Actually, it's an amendment to what's called Article 2 of our organizing document, the Bylaws of the Unitarian Universalist Association. Over the past 40 years, since about 1983, we've been symbolically pledging allegiance by covenanting our congregations to affirm and promote our association's 6 sources and 6 principles, now 7, and for some congregations, 8 principles. And over the past 3 years, we've seen the widespread discussion and adoption of that new 8th principle by many, but not all, congregations. Adoption of that principle calls our congregations to active engagement with anti-racism and anti-oppression. But over the past 3 years, our association leadership has been on a separate track, setting up a special commission 3 years ago to reconsider how our covenantal relationship might be more effectively restated and recentered. And from what I understand, our leaders and staff had become aware that our principles and purposes have stated what our central shared values are, but not why and how we are going to affirm and promote those principles. So the proposed amendments to Article 2 of the bylaws would not mean we would give up our covenants as we have tried to memorize them over the past 30 years or so. They would just be removed from the bylaws as the organizing principles. Their essence would be incorporated in a different framework if the delegates to next year's General Assembly, which, by the way, has been decided will be totally virtual. You won't be able to go and be a delegate there, wherever there is. You will have to be online to participate in any way. But the other side of that change is that everybody can participate without spending money to go some particular place and pay registration fees and hotels and airline fees to get to the place. So I wanted to contrast the operative language of the current bylaws, which is, we, the member congregations of the UUA, covenant to affirm and promote, and the principles, 7 or 8. The proposed central language would be, the purpose of our association is to actively engage members in the transformation of the world through liberating love. And then we covenant congregation to congregation and through our association, not only to affirm and promote, but to support and assist one another in our ministries. So it's asking us to build essentially association connections at the congregational level, not up to the association, but through our relational, those in propinquity to us, those who are close to us, those who need our help. A large congregation can be called upon to assist a congregation like this, which is a small fellowship without a professional minister, to actually accomplish these major aims. I will share with you that they've built an ideogram, a meme that has as its central principle the sense of love as the transforming and motivating value. And the other values that are lifted up are interdependence, pluralism, justice, transformation, generosity, and equity. So there are still 7 principles, but they're more inclusive and broader language, and we are called upon to actually support and assist each other in transforming the world. That's a really significant mind change about how we think of ourselves. What does it mean to be a Unitarian Universalist congregation? What does it mean to be part of a Unitarian Universalist association and congregation? Like many of you 30 years ago, I thought it was wonderful to have written down some values that seemed incontestable. I'm not here today to explain all of the process or to sell you on the changes per se, but I'm here to challenge us all to look at this in a new light, with a broader perspective, and see if this language doesn't improve and enlarge our sense of who we are. And at the bottom of the proposed changes, love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We must hold each other accountable for doing the work of living our shared values through that spiritual discipline of love. And so what I wanted to share with you today is my recognition is that at my advanced age, well over 70, I often react reflexively to uncomfortable change with a degree of reluctance and resistance. Like many of you, 30 years ago, I thought it was wonderful to get a pager and then a primitive cell phone so I could stay in touch with people that mattered to me wherever I happened to be during the day. But if I wanted to have a serious conversation, that seemed like it was pointless, that the landline was something that AT&T had perfected over 100 years so that you could actually have a conversation that wouldn't be dropped and that you could actually talk simultaneously and both sides would hear the full conversation. The cell phone has added so much to our capabilities, but we have lost that sense of a clarity between us in so many of our conversations. But what I think this proposed change is about is improving clarity and making us understand better what life as a Unitarian Universalist can and maybe should be. Most of us don't have landlines, and we put up with dropped cell calls or static or other glitches as unavoidable complications of that convenience of having that phone with us every second. And I ask myself sometimes, why should I have to learn how to use yet another computer system or software application or add another app to my phone that I have to know a password for? Just to buy a ticket to the movies, or make a reservation at a restaurant, or to pay a doctor's bill, or to get my jacket back from the cleaner? There is so much inconvenience associated with using computers that make life simpler somehow. But there are benefits to the new systems, new ways of doing things, and there's always losses too. And so what I figured out, and I went to look on Wikipedia about whether this is something that other people have discovered too, is that part of what's going on for me is grief, that I hate losing what I found comfortable. And I've discovered that what grief is defined as is the love that has to find a place to go when the person or value or convenience that we have cared about is no longer present. And grief cuts us deeply if we have profound attachment or love for something or someone. And so in preparing my talk for today, I discovered there's an analog for the 5-step grief cycle that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross described so many 50 years ago. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and possibly acceptance. But there's an adapted model about having grief about any kind of change. It's called the change curve, which also has 6 stages. When a change is introduced, there's a distancing reaction and saying, those people are making me change and I don't like it. That's stage 1. Stage 2 is self-criticism, where we say, I don't want to have to deal with the change and I'm just not adequate. It's too much work for me. I don't want to change. Resistance or inability to adapt. Stage 3 in this change model says that there's confusion and doubt about how to incorporate the changes that are asked of us without losing our attachment to the old ways. And I think I'm somewhere on stage 3. That's where we ask questions about what does it mean? Questions like, what will I lose or gain if this change is happening around me? And can I or how should I relate to that new status quo? Can I continue with the same commitment to the new paradigm that I had to the old paradigm? Stage 4 is rationalization, or reluctant acceptance of what is changing by letting go of the old model that worked just fine for me. So I begin to explore the new reality by testing and learning what is gain or loss as a result of the change. And that's what I'm asking you to explore here. And Stage 5 is about problem solving, finding solutions by rebuilding our paradigms, and exploring innovations which might be made possible by the changes, which over the last 40 years I've seen so many variations on the chalice as the symbol of Unitarian Universalism, and how some of those were very bizarre and unwelcome, and others, after a while, I got used to them. And finally, there's a Stage 6 where they say you might be willing to move on because the new status quo is already established and the basis for new cycles of change can be imagined and initiated. So over the next 10 months or so, there'll be literature, and there'll be in the World magazine, there'll be various ways that our Unitarian Universalist Association leadership will introduce to us what this means and what the changes are still open for us because they're not adopted yet. The vote next summer could be a vote up, the changes will be adopted formally, or a vote down, that they will not. And so we have a chance as a congregation and as individuals to give our input to through the delegate process, but also through having focus groups or discussions about what this potential change might mean to all of us and why we might welcome it or we might not. Well, I ask you to consider this over the next several months and see if you care one way or the other, because always, as with any democratic process, you can say, I don't care. It's not my problem. Somebody else can figure it out. But also, you can choose to be engaged and understand what is being proposed and what it might mean, not just to those of us who are already Unitarian Universalists, but whether it's a new sales option to the folks who are not coming into the churches, who are maybe testing it online and saying, well, I don't like that sermon, but I do like the principles. And it's a possibility of opening Unitarian Universalism to new people who will change it, because we know that having folks who are different from ourselves is a way of saying that we want to leave a legacy to the next generation and the generations beyond that is even more embracing of difference, of diversity, of equity, and of love. May we find in ourselves the motivating power of compassion and love that brings us to building a wider legacy for the generations to follow. Thank you for your attention this morning.